Chapter 55 of the Pickwick Papers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. This recording by Patty Brugman. Chapter 55 of the Pickwick Papers. Mr. Solomon Pell, assisted by a Select Committee of Coachmen, arranges the affairs of the elder Mr. Weller. "Samivel," said Mr. Weller, accosting his son in the morning after the funeral. "I've found it, Sammy. I thought it was there." "Thought what was where?" inquired Sammy. "Your mother-in-law's will, Sammy," replied Mr. Weller. "In word to your wish, them arrangements is to be made, as I told you on last night, respecting the funds." "What? Didn't she tell you where it was?" inquired Sam. "Not a bit on it, Sammy," replied Mr. Weller. "We was adjusting our little differences, and I was cheering her spirits and bowing her up, so that I forgot to ask anything about it. I don't know as I should have done it, indeed, if I had remembered it," said Mr. Weller. "For it's a rum sort of thing, Sammy, to go a-hinkering arter somebody's property when you're assisting them in illness. It's like helping an outside passenger up when he's been pitched off a coach, and putting your hand in his pocket while you ask him with a sigh how he finds himself, Sammy." With this figurative illustration of his meaning, Mr. Weller unclasped his pocket-book and drew forth a dirty sheet of letter paper on which were inscribed various characters crowded together in remarkable confusion. "This here's a document, Sammy," said Mr. Weller. "I found it in a little black teapot on the top shelf of the bar closet. She used to keep banknotes there afore she was married, Samivel. I've seen her take the lid off to pay a bill many a time. Poor creature, she might have filled all the teapots in the house with bills and not have inconvenienced herself neither, for she took werry little of anything in that way lately, except on the temperance nights, when they just laid a foundation of tea to put the spirits atop on." "What does it say?" inquired Sam. "Just what I told you, my boy," rejoined his parent. £200 worth of reduced counsels to my son-in-law Samivel, and all the rest of my property, every kind and description whatsoever, to my husband, Mr. Tony Weller, who I appoint as my sole exeter." "That's all, is it?" said Sam. "That's all," replied Mr. Weller. "And I suppose it's all right and satisfactory to you and me, as it's only parties interested. We may as well put the bit of paper into the fire." "What are you doing on, you lunatic?" said Sam, snatching the paper away as his parent, in all innocence, stirred the fire preparatory to suiting the action to the word. "You're a nice executor, you are." "Why not?" inquired Mr. Weller, looking sternly round with the poker in his hand. "Why not?" exclaimed Sam. "'Cause it might be proved and probated and swore to, and all manner of formalities." "You don't mean that," said Mr. Weller, laying down the poker. Sam buttoned the will carefully into a side pocket, intimating by a look, meanwhile, that he did mean it, and very seriously too. "Then I'll tell you what it is," said Mr. Weller, after a short meditation. "This is a case for the confidential pal of the Chancellorship. Pell must look into this, Sammy. He's the man for a difficult question at law. We'll have this here brought afore the Solvent Court directly, Samivel." "I never did see such an addle-headed old creature," exclaimed Sam irritably. "Old Baileys and Solvent Courts and alibis and every sort of gammon always running through his brain. You'd better get your out-of-door clothes on and come to town about this business than stand a-preaching there about what you don't understand nothing on." "Very good, Sammy," replied Mr. Weller. "I'm quite agreeable to anything as will expedite business, Sammy. But mind this here, my boy, nobody but Pell as a legal adwiser." "I don't want anybody else," replied Sam. "Now are you coming?" "Wait a minute, Sammy," replied Mr. Weller, who, having tied his shawl with the aid of a small glass that hung in the window, was now, by dint of the most wonderful exertions, struggling into his upper garments. "Wait a minute, Sammy. When you grow as old as your father, you won't get into your waistcoat quite as easy as you do now, my boy." "If I couldn't get into it any easier than that, I'm blessed if I'd wear one at all," rejoined his son. "You think so now," said Mr. Weller, with the gravity of age, "but you'll find that as you get wider, you'll get wiser. Wit and wisdom, Sammy, always grows together." As Mr. Weller delivered this infallible maxim, the result of many years' personal experience and observation, he contrived by a dexterous twist of his body to get the bottom button of his coat to perform its office. Having paused a few seconds to recover breath, he brushed his hat with his elbow and declared himself ready. "As 4 heads is better than 2, Sammy," said Mr. Weller, as they drove along the London road in a chaise cart, "and as all this here property is a wery great temptation to a legal gentleman, we'll take a couple of friends o' mine with us, as'll be wery soon down upon him if anything regular. 2 of them as saw you to the Fleet that day. They're the wery best judges," added Mr. Weller in a half-whisper, "the wery best judges of a horse you ever knowed." "And of a lawyer, too?" inquired Sam. "The man as can form accurate judgment of an animal can form an accurate judgment of anything," replied his father, so dogmatically that Sam did not attempt to controvert this position. In pursuance of this notable resolution, the services of the mottle-faced gentleman and of 2 other very fat coachmen, selected by Mr. Weller, probably with a view to their wit and consequent wisdom, were put into requisition, and this assistance having been secured, the party proceeded to the public house in Portugal Street, whence a messenger was dispatched to the Insolvent Court over the way, requiring Mr. Solomon Pell's immediate attendance. The messenger fortunately found Mr. Solomon Pell in court, regaling himself, business being rather slack, with the cold collation of an Abernethy biscuit and a saveloy. The message was no sooner whispered in his ear than he thrust them in his pocket among various professional documents, and hurried over the way with such alacrity that he reached the parlour before the messenger had even emancipated himself from the court. "Gentlemen," said Mr. Pell, touching his hat, "my service to you all. I don't say it to flatter you, gentlemen, but there are not 5 other men in the world that I have come out to the court for to-day." "So busy, eh?" said Sam. "Busy," replied Pell. "I'm completely sewn up, as my friend the late Lord Chancellor many a time used to say to me, gentlemen, when he came out from hearing appeals in the House of Lords. Poor fellow, he was very susceptible of fatigue. He used to feel those appeals uncommonly. I actually thought more than once that he'd have sunk under 'em. I did indeed." Here Mr. Pell shook his head and paused, on which the elder Mr. Weller, nudging his neighbour, as begging him to mark the attorney's high connections, asked whether the duties in question produced any permanent ill effects on the constitution of his noble friend. "I don't think he ever quite recovered them," replied Pell. "In fact, I'm sure he never did. 'Pell,' he used to say to me many a time, 'how the blazes can you stand the head work you do is a mystery to me.' 'Well,' I used to answer, 'I hardly know how I do it, upon my life.' 'Pell,' he'd add, sighing and looking at me with a little envy. Friendly envy, you know, gentlemen, mere friendly envy. I never minded it. 'Pell, you're a wonder, a wonder.' Ah, you'd have liked him very much if you had known him, gentlemen. Bring me 3 pennyworth of rum, my dear." Addressing this latter remark to the witness in a tone of subdued grief, Mr. Pell sighed, looked at his shoes and the ceiling, and the rum having by that time arrived, drunk it up. "However," said Pell, drawing a chair to the table, "a professional man has no right to think of his private friendships when his legal assistance is wanted. By the by, gentlemen, since I saw you here before, we have had to weep over a very melancholy occurrence." Mr. Pell drew out a pocket handkerchief when he came to the word weep. but he made no further use of it than to wipe away a slight tinge of rum which hung upon his upper lip. "I saw it in the Adviser, Mr. Weller," continued Pell. "Bless my soul, not more than 52. Dear me, only think." These indications of amusing spirit were addressed to the mottle-faced man, whose eyes Mr. Pell had accidentally caught, on which the mottle-faced man, whose apprehension of matters in general was of a foggy nature, moved uneasily to the seat that opened him. Indeed, so far as that went, there was no saying how things was brought about, which observation, involving one of those subtle propositions which it is difficult to encounter, argument was controverted by nobody. "I have heard it remarked that she was a very fine woman, Mr. Weller," said Pell in a sympathizing manner. "Yes, sir, she was," replied the elder Mr. Weller, not much relishing this mode of discussing the subject, and yet thinking that the attorney, from his long intimacy with the late Lord Chancellor, must know best on all matters of polite breeding. "She was a wery fine woman, sir, when I first knowed her. She was a widow, sir, at that time." "Now it is curious," said Pell, looking round with a sorrowful smile. "Mrs. Pell was a widow." "That is very extraordinary," said the mottled-faced man. "Well, it is a curious coincidence," said Pell. "Not at all," gruffly remarked the elder Mr. Weller. "More widows is married than single women." Very good," said Pell. "You're quite right, Mr. Weller. Mrs. Pell was a very elegant and accomplished woman. Her manners were the theme of universal admiration in our neighbourhood. I was proud to see that woman dance. There was something so firm and dignified and yet natural in her motion. Her cutting, gentlemen, was simply itself. Ah, well, excuse me asking the question, Mr. Somerville," continued the attorney in a lower voice. "Was your mother-in-law tall?" "Not very," replied Sam. "Mrs. Pell was a tall figure," said Pell. "A splendid woman, with a noble shape and a nose, gentlemen, formed to command and be majestic. She was very much attached to me, very much. Highly connected, too. Her mother's brother, gentlemen, failed for £800 as a law stationer." "Well," said Mr. Weller, who had grown rather restless during this discussion, "with regards to business." The word was music to Pell's ears. He had been resolving in his mind whether any business was to be transacted, or whether he had been merely invited to partake of a glass of brandy and water, or a bowl of punch, or any similar professional compliment. And now the doubt was set at rest without his appearing at all eager for its solution. His eyes glistened as he laid his hat on the table and said, "What is the business upon 'em? Either of these gentlemen wish to go through the court? We require an arrest. A friendly arrest will do, you know. We are all friends here, I suppose." "Give me the documents, Sammy," said Mr. Weller, taking the will from his son, who appeared to enjoy the interview amazingly. "What we require, sir, is a probe of this here." "Probate, my dear sir, probate," said Pell. "Well, sir," replied Mr. Weller sharply, "probe and probe is very much the same. If you don't understand what I mean, sir, I dare say I can find them as does." "No offence, I hope, Mr. Weller," said Pell meekly. "You are the executor, I see," he added, casting his eyes over the paper. "I am, sir," replied Mr. Weller. "These other gentlemen, I presume, are legatees, are they?" inquired Pell with a congratulatory smile. "Sammy is a legatee," replied Mr. Weller. "These other gentlemen is friends of mine, just come to see fair, a kind of umpires." "Oh," said Mr. Pell, "very good. I have no objections, I'm sure. I shall want a matter of £5 of you before I begin. Ha, ha, ha." It being decided by the committee that the £5 might be advanced, Mr. Weller produced that sum, after which a long consultation about nothing particular took place, in the course whereof Mr. Pell demonstrated to the perfect satisfaction of the gentleman who saw fair that unless the management of the business had been entrusted to him, it must all have gone wrong, for reasons not clearly made out, but no doubt sufficient. This important point being dispatched, Mr. Pell refreshed himself with 3 chops, and liquids both malt and spirituous, and the expense of the estate, and then they all went away to Doctors' Commons. The next day there was another visit to the Doctors' Commons, and a great to-do with an attesting hostler, who, being inebriated, declined swearing anything but profane oaths, to the great scandal of a proctor and surrogate. Next week there were more visits to Doctors' Commons, and there was a visit to the Legacy Duty Office besides, and there were treaties entered into for the disposal of the lease and business, and ratifications of the same, and inventories to be made out, and lunches to be taken, and dinners to be eaten, and so many profitable things to be done, and such a mass of papers accumulated, that Mr. Solomon Pell and a boy, and the blue bag to boot, all got so stout that scarcely anybody would have known them for the same man, boy, and bag that had loitered about Portugal Street a few days before. At length, all these weighty matters being arranged, a day was fixed for selling out and transferring the stock, and of waiting with that view upon Wilkins, Flasher, Esq., stockbroker of somewhere near the bank, who had been recommended by Mr. Solomon Pell for the purpose. It was a kind of festive occasion, and the parties were attired accordingly. Mr. Weller's tops were newly cleaned, and his dress was arranged with particular care. The mottled-faced gentleman wore at his buttonhole a full-sized dahlia, with several leaves, and the coats of his 2 friends were adorned with nosegays and laurel and other evergreens. All 3 were habited in strict holiday costume. That is to say, they were wrapped up to the chins, and wore as many clothes as possible, which is, and has been, a stage-coachman's idea of full dress ever since stage-coaches were invented. Mr. Pell was waiting at the usual place of meeting at the appointed time. Even Mr. Pell wore a pair of gloves and a clean shirt much frayed at the collar and wristbands by frequent washings. 1:45, said Pell, looking at the parlour clock. If we are with Mr. Flasher at 1:15, we shall just hit the best time. What should you say to a drop of beer, gentlemen? Suggested the mottled-faced gentleman. And a little bit of cold beef, said the second coachman. Or an oyster, added the third, who was a hoarse gentleman, supported by very round legs. Hear, hear, said Pell. To congratulate Mr. Weller on his coming into possession of his property, eh? Ha, ha. I'm quite agreeable, gentlemen, answered Mr. Weller. Sammy, pull the bell. Sam complied, and the porter, cold beef, and oysters being promptly produced, the lunch was done ample justice to. Where everybody took so active a part, it is almost invidious to make a distinction. But if one individual evinced greater powers than another, it was the coachman with the hoarse voice, who took an imperial pint of vinegar with his oysters without betraying the least emotion. Mr. Pell, sir, said the elder Mr. Weller, stirring a glass of brandy and water, of which one was placed before every gentleman when the oyster shells were removed. Mr. Pell, sir, it was my intention to have proposed the funds on the occasion, but Samivel has whispered to me. Here Mr. Samuel Weller, who had silently eaten his oysters with tranquil smiles, cried, Here, in a very loud voice. Has whispered to me, resumed his father, that it would be better to devote the liquor to wishing you success and prosperity, and thanking you for the manner in which you've brought this here business through. Here's to your health, sir. Hold hard there, interposed the mottled-faced gentleman with a sudden urgency. Your eyes on me, gentlemen. Saying this, the mottled-faced gentleman rose, and did the other gentleman. The mottled-faced gentleman reviewed the company, and slowly lifted his hand, upon which every man, including him of the mottled countenance, drew a long breath and lifted his tumbler to his lips. In one instant the mottled-faced gentleman depressed his hand again, and every glass was set down empty. It is impossible to describe the thrilling effect produced by this striking ceremony. At once dignified, solemn, and impressive, It combined every element of grandeur. "Well, gentlemen," said Mr. Pell, "all I can say is that such marks of confidence must be very gratifying to a professional man. I don't wish to say anything that might appear egotistical, gentlemen, but I'm very glad for your own sakes that you came to see me. That is all. If you had gone to any low member of the profession, it's my firm conviction, and I assure you of it as a fact, that you would have found yourselves in Queer Street before this. I could have wished my noble friend that had been alive to have seen my management of this case. I don't say it out of pride, but I think, however, gentlemen, I won't trouble you with that. I'm generally to be found here, gentlemen, but if I'm not here or over the way, that's my address. You'll find my terms very cheap and reasonable, and no man attends more to his clients than I do, and I hope I know a little of my profession besides. If you have any opportunity of recommending me to any of your friends, gentlemen, I shall be very much obliged to you, and so will they too, when they come to know me. Your healths, gentlemen." With this expression of his feelings, Mr. Solomon Pell laid 3 small written cards before Mr. Weller's friends, and looking at the clock again, feared it was time to be walking. Upon this hint, Mr. Weller settled the bill, and issuing forth, the executor, legatee, attorney, and umpires directed their steps toward the city. The office of Wilkins Flasher, Esquire, of the Exchange, was in a first floor, up a court behind the Bank of England. The house of Wilkins Flasher, Esquire, was at Brixton, Surrey. The horse and stanhope of Wilkins Flasher, Esquire, were at an adjacent livery stable. The groom of Wilkins Flasher, Esquire, was on his way to West End to deliver some game. The clerk of Wilkins Flasher, Esquire, had gone to his dinner, and so Wilkins Flasher, Esquire, himself cried, "Come in," when Mr. Pell and his companions knocked at the courting-house door. "Good morning, sir," said Mr. Pell, bowing obsequiously. "We want to make a little transfer, if you please." "Oh, come in, will you?" said Mr. Flasher. "Sit down a minute. I'll attend to you directly." "Thank you, sir," said Mr. Pell. "There's no hurry. Take a chair, Mr. Weller." Mr. Weller took a chair, and Sam took a box, and the umpires took what they could get, and looked at the almanac and 1 or 2 papers which were wafered against the wall with as much open-eyed reverence as if they had been the finest efforts of the old masters. "Well, I'll bet you half a dozen claret on it. Come," said Wilkins Flasher, Esquire, resuming the conversation to which Mr. Pell's entrance had caused a momentary interruption. This was addressed to a very smart young gentleman who wore his hat on his right whisker, and was lounging over the desk, killing flies with a ruler. Wilkins Flasher, Esquire, was balancing himself on 2 legs of an office stool, spearing a wafer box with a penknife, which he dropped every now and then with great dexterity into the very centre of a small red wafer that was stuck outside. Both gentlemen had very open waistcoats, and very rolling collars, and very small boots, and very big rings, and very little watches, and very large guard chains, and symmetrical inexpressibles, and scented pocket handkerchiefs. "I never bet half a dozen," said the other gentleman. "I'll take a dozen." "Done, Simmery, done," said Wilkins Flasher, Esquire. "P.P. mind," observed the other. "Of course," replied Wilkins Flasher, Esquire. Wilkins Flasher, Esquire, entered it in a little book with a gold pencil case, and the other gentleman entered it also in another little book with another gold pencil case. "I see there's a notice up this morning about Boffer," observed Mr. Simmery. "Poor devil, he's expelled the house." "I'll bet you 10 guineas to 5 he cuts his throat," said Wilkins Flasher, Esquire. "Done," replied Mr. Simmery. "Stop, I bar," said Wilkins Flasher, Esquire, thoughtfully. "Perhaps he may hang himself." "Very good," rejoined Mr. Simmery, pulling out his gold pencil case again. "I've no objection to take you that way. say makes away with himself. Kills himself, in fact, said Wilkins Flasher, Esquire. Just so, replied Mr. Simmery, putting it down. Flasher, 10 guineas to 5. Boffer kills himself. Within what time, shall we say? A fortnight, suggested Wilkins Flasher, Esquire. Confound it, no, rejoined Mr. Simmery, stopping for an instant to smash a fly with the ruler. Say a week. Split the difference, said Wilkins Flasher, Esquire. Make it 10 days. Well, 10 days, rejoined Mr. Simmery. So it was entered down in the little books that Boffer was to kill himself within 10 days, or Wilkins Flasher, Esquire, was to hand over Frank Simmery, Esquire, the sum of 10 guineas, and that if Boffer did kill himself within that time, Frank Simmery, Esquire, would pay to Wilkins Flasher, Esquire, 5 guineas instead. I'm very sorry he has failed, said Wilkins Flasher, Esquire. Capital dinners he gave. Fine port he had, too, remarked Mr. Simmery. We are going to send our butler to the sale tomorrow to pick up some 5 of that 64. The devil you are, said Wilkins Flasher, Esquire. My man's going too. 5 guineas my man outbids your man. Done. Another entry was made in the little books with the gold pencil cases, and Mr. Simmery, having by this time killed all the flies and taken all the bets, strolled away to the Stock Exchange to see what was going forward. Wilkins Flasher, Esquire, now condescended to receive Mr. Solomon Pell's instructions, and having filed up some printed forms, requested the party to follow him to the bank, which they did, Mr. Weller and his 3 friends staring at all they beheld in unbounded astonishment, and Sam encountering everything with a coolness which nothing could disturb. Crossing a courtyard which was all noise and bustle, and passing a couple of porters who seemed dressed to match the red fire engine which was wheeled away into a corner, they passed into an office where their business was to be transacted, and where Pell and Mr. Flasher left them standing for a few moments while they went upstairs into the will office. "What place is this here?" whispered the mottled-faced gentleman to the elder Mr. Weller. "Counsel's office," replied the executor in a whisper. "What are those gentlemen a-setting behind the counters?" asked the horsed coachman. "Reduced counsels, I suppose," replied Mr. Weller. "Ain't they reduced counsels, some of 'em?" "Why, you don't suppose the reduced counsels is alive, do you?" inquired Sam with some disdain. "How should I know?" retorted Mr. Weller. "I thought they looked very like it. What are they, then?" "Clerks," replied Sam. "What are they all eating ham sandwiches for?" inquired his father. "'Cause it's their duty, I suppose," replied Sam. "It's a part of the system. They're always a-doing it here, all day long." Mr. Weller and his friends had scarcely had a moment to reflect upon this singular regulation as connected with the monetary system of the country, when they were rejoined by Pell and Wilkins Flasher, Esquire, who led them to a part of the counter above which was a round black board with a large W on it. "What's that for?" inquired Mr. Weller, directing Pell's attention to the target in question. "The first letter of the name of the deceased," replied Pell. "I say," said Mr. Weller, turning round to the umpires, "there's something wrong here. W's our letter. This won't do." The referees at once gave it their decided opinion that the business could not be legally proceeded with under the letter W, and in all probability it would have stood over for one day at least had it not been for the prompt, though at first sight dutiful, behaviour of Sam, who, seizing his father by the skirt of the coat, dragged him to the counter and pinned him there until he had affixed his signature to a couple of instruments, which, from Mr. Weller's habit of printing, was a work of so much labour and time that the officiating clerk peeled and ate 3 Ribston pippins while it was performing. As the elder Mr. Weller insisted on selling out his portion forthwith, they proceeded from the bank to the gate of the Stock Exchange, to which Wilkins Flasher, Esquire, after a short absence, returned with a cheque on Smith Payne, and Smith for £530, that being the sum of money to which Mr. Weller, at the market price of the day, was entitled, in consideration of the balance of the second Mrs. Weller's fund savings. Sam's £200 stood transferred to his name, and Wilkins Flasher, Esquire, having been paid his commission, dropped the money carelessly into his coat pocket and lounged back to his office. Mr. Weller was at first obstinately determined on cashing the cheque in nothing but sovereigns, but it being represented by the umpires that by doing so he must incur the expense of a small sack to carry them home in, he consented to receive the amount in £5 notes. "My son," said Mr. Weller, as they came out of the banking-house, "my son and me has a wery particular engagement this afternoon, and I should like to have this here business settled out of hand. So let's just go straight away somewhere where we can audit the accounts." A quiet room was soon found, and the accounts were produced and audited. Mr. Pell's bill was taxed by Sam, and some charges were disallowed by the umpires, but notwithstanding Mr. Pell's declaration, accompanied with many solemn asseverations that they were really too hard upon him, it was by very many degrees the best professional job he had ever had, and one on which he boarded, lodged, and washed for 6 months afterwards. The umpires, having partaken of a dram, shook hands and departed, as they had to drive out of town that night. Mr. Solomon Pell, finding that nothing more was going forward either in the eating or drinking way, took a friendly leave, and Sam and his father were left alone. "There," said Mr. Weller, thrusting his pocket-book in his side pocket, "with the bills for the lease and that, there's £1180 here. Now, Samivel, my boy, turn the horses' heads to the George and Wilfer." End of chapter 55. Read by Patty Brugman.